Good day everyone, I am Remark Bigayo and my companion for this report are Miss Danelle Earl Sophie Polior and Miss Mara Vanessa Horton. We are Group 7 and we will go into report the Chapter 7 entitled The Landscape of Memory, Mental Images, Maps, and Proposition. So the topic outline for my report are mental representation of knowledge, communicating knowledge, pictures versus words, pictures in your mind, mental imagery, dual code theory, images and symbols, storing knowledge as abstract concepts, propositional theory, limitation of mental images, and limitation of propositional theory. The intended learning outcomes are comprehend how knowledge is stored and represented in our minds, identify what form of knowledge can be represented in our mind, and discuss the different kind of mental representation, and lastly, understand what is proposition. Okay, the first topic that I will going to discuss is mental representation of knowledge. So under this, we have mental representation and knowledge representations. So first, what is mental representation? So it is defined as something that stands for these people of what you know about them. So in figure 7.2, as you can see, there are pictures presented on the screen. So you will going to do is cover the picture, and after covering the picture, describes the person of what he or she looks like and what her or she sounds like. So um, just like for example, we covered the picture of Barack Obama. So how are we going to describe or recall Barack Obama after we cover his picture? So we will say that Barack Obama has a short hair, he has a high nose, and he ups his left hand, and his mouth is open. So that is something that stands for Barack Obama after we cover his picture. So second is knowledge representation. So it is defined as the form for what you know in your mind about things, ideas, event, and so on in the outside world. So dito naman sa knowledge representation daw, it is the form in our mind that about mga bagay or mga ideas or event that nangyayari sa ating outside world. So when we base it, so ito din yung mga bagay na ating nakikita or mga events na ating nakikita. And ito yung mga ideas na ating nakikita in our vivid eyes or in our outside world or nakikita natin ngayon. So that is knowledge representations. So, in mental representation of knowledge, there are approach na ginagamit para malaman how people represent knowledge in their mind. So the first is the rationalist approach. So in this approach, we try to deduce logically how people represent knowledge. So dito daw, sinusubukan natin i-locate or suriin logically kung paano daw nire-represent ng mga tao ang knowledge sa kanilang mind. So the second is the classic epistemology. So classic epistemology is the study of nature, origins, and limits of human knowledge. So under classic epistemology, there are two knowledges. So the first is the declarative knowledge. So it refers to the fact that can't be stated, such as date of your birth, the name of your best friend, or the way a rabbit looked. So the second is the procedural knowledge, refers to the knowledge of procedures that can be implemented. So the example is tying your shoelaces, adding a column numbers, and driving a car. So of course, I know that all of us observe and really use these two knowledges, the declarative and procedural knowledge, in our daily lives. When we try to recall something or when we try to describe something, and of course, when we try to answer a question. So the next is the standard laboratory experiments. So researchers indirectly study knowledge representation because they cannot look into people's mind directly. So they observe how people handle various cognitive tasks that requires the manipulation of mentally represented knowledge. So ang mga researchers daw is hindi nila kayang pag-aralan directly yung mga tao, yung kung paano represent ng tao yung knowledge sa kanilang utak. Kasi, of course, hindi mo naman talaga mababasa at makikita kung anong nasa loob sa loob ng utak ng isang tao. So, para malaman mo ito, you have to undergo or undergone a series of experiment or test. So, ito yung ginawa ng standard laboratory experiment para malaman how people represent knowledge in their mind. So, the next is the neuropsychological studies. So, researchers typically use one or two methods. So, the first method that they use is they observe how the normal brain responds to various cognitive tasks involving knowledge representation. And the second one is they observe the link between various deficits in knowledge representation and the association pathologies in the brain. So the next is the external representation. So this is under the communicating knowledge, pictures versus words. So in external representation, it designates structures in the environment that allow the learner to interact with some content domain. So example nito is book from the word external. So nasa labas or kaya natin siyang tingnan or nahahawakan natin siya. So gaya ng book. So a book communicates ideas through words and actions. Of course, we can learn books. We can learn through books because we can see different words and pictures in the books that nagbibigay sa atin ng knowledge and ideas. So, the question here is, how do external representation in words differ from such representation in pictures? So there is an example here. Suppose someone asks you what is the shape of chicken egg. You may find drawing an egg easier than describing it. And many geometric shapes and concrete objects seems easier to represent in pictures rather than in words. So however, what if someone asks you what is justice? Describing such an abstract concept in words would already be very difficult, but doing so pictorially would be even harder. So of course, there are things in our lives that we can easily describe or recall using pictures, using shapes, or using size. However, there are things that we can easily describe or recall using words, diba? Or we can easily explain using words. So that is the difference between the two. And it depends upon the situation and how we going to represent the word. How are we going to use word to represent knowledge, and how are we going to use pictures and represent knowledge? So it just depends upon the situations and the questions. So under the communicating knowledge versus words. So as you can see in the figure 7.3, there is an example here. So the first in figure 7.3a, there is a picture depicted the table and the cat. In figure 7.b, there is a sentence state that the cat is under the table. So now, we'll first discuss the 7.3a. So the picture is relatively analogous or similar to the real world object it represents. So the picture shows concrete attributes such as shape and relative size. These attributes are similar to the features and properties of the real world object the picture represents. Even if you cover up a portion of the figure of a cat, what remains still looks like a part of a cat, of course. So, when we see a picture, diba, it really similar to what is the, to the outside world, diba? So, when we capture a photo, so it really copy or nakikita talaga natin na real yung nakukuha ng pictures. Or when we say pictures, parehong-pareho talaga siya sa outside world. So under typical circumstances, most aspects of the pictures are grasped simultaneously, but you may scan the picture, zoom in for a closer look, or zoom out to see the big picture. Even when scanning or zooming, however, there are no arbitrary rules for looking at the picture. You may scan the picture from the left to the right, from the bottom to the top, however it pleases you. So kahit na i-zoom natin, kahit na i-move natin yung picture from left to the right, so makikita pa rin natin kung ano yung gustong i-represent ng isang picture, yung isang photos. So however, meron tayong tinatawag na symbolic representations. So this is the relationship between the word and what it represents is simply arbitrary. So example, if you've grown up in another country like Germany or France, the word Katzi or the word shot respectively would instead symbolize the concept of cat to you. Suppose you cover up the word cat, the remaining visible part of no longer bears even symbolic relationship to any part of a cat. So dito daw sa symbolic representation, we use symbols to represent knowledge in our mind. So ang example na binigay dito is, kapag daw nasa Germany ka or nasa France ka, when you heard the word Katzi or shot, it really symbolizes the word cat. Kasi ang tawag sa cat sa Germany is Katzi, at ang tawag naman sa cat sa France is shot or shot. So there are other examples. In forming words, the sounds or letter also must be sequenced according to rules. So for example, CAT, as you read it, this is cat. So ACT, if you read it, this is not sounds like cat, and TCA, you can read it as a cat. So in forming sentence, the words also must be sequenced according to the rule. So in symbol representation, it is very important na dapat naka-sequence or naka-accordance sa rule when yung isang sentence or yung isang word. Kasi kapag hindi siya naka-sequence or hindi siya sumunod sa rule, so just like naka-rumble siya, so mawawala na yung meaning or maiiba na yung symbols, may iba na yung nare-represent ng symbols. So one can say that under the table, but table under the cat is. So 'di ba, just like the given sentence. So mas naiintindihan mo kapag babasahin mo, the cat is under the table. So unlike kapag babasahin mo nga muna, table under cat ka is, 'di ba? So it is very important that when using symbols, dapat it is accordance to the rule or dapat nakasequence siya accordingly. So next, the picture in the picture in figure 7.3a shows the spatial relationship between the cat and the table. For any given picture showing a cat and a table, the spatial or positional relationship beside, below, behind will be represented concretely in the pictures. Of course, it is very important or um, it is very easy to represent something using picture kasi nade-depict niya at napapakita niya talaga kung ano yung tunay na posisyon ng isang bagay. Just like the cat, di ba? Yung position ng cat sa table. So, in contrast, when using words, we must state spatial relationship between things explicitly by a discrete symbol such as preposition. The cat is under the table. So, more abstract relationship, however, such as class membership, often are implied by the meaning of the words. Cats are mammals, or tables are items or furniture, but abstract relationship rarely are implied through pictures. So, kapag gumagamit naman daw tayo ng words, dapat we must be very specific kung ano yung dinidescribe natin or kung ano yung nire-represent natin, di ba? Kasi if hindi tayo naging specific when we are using words on describing something or representing something, So, maiiba na yung meaning niya or yung ibig sabihin. So, that is pictures versus words. Okay. The next is pictures amply captures concrete and spatial information in a manner analogous to whatever they represent. They convey all features simultaneously. In general, any rules for creating or understanding pictures pertain to the analogous relationship within the picture and what it represents. They help ensure such as similarities as possible and between the picture and the object it represents. Words, on the contrary, handily capture abstract and categorical information in a manner that is symbolic of whatever the words represent. Representations in words usually convey information sequentially. They do so according to arbitrary rules that have little to do with what the words represent. Pictures and words are both well suited to some purpose but not to others. So the next is pictures in your mind, mental imagery. Imagery is the mental representation of things that are not currently seen or seen by the sense organ. Imagery may involve mental representations in any of the sensory modalities, such as hearing, smell, or taste. Each form of mental representation is subject to investigation. Most research on the imagery in cognitive psychology has focused on visual imagery, such as representation of objects or settings that are not presently visible to the eye. For example, one student kept a diary of their mental images. The student reported many more visual images than auditory, smell, touch, or taste images. So, of course, when we are reporting our um, experiences, so mas marami tayong nasasabi using our visual images kung ano yung nakikita natin, di ba? Other than kung ano naririnig natin or kung ano yung naaamoy natin or nalalasahan natin. Mas probably, mas ginagamit natin yung visual images natin. So, we use visual images to solve problems and to answer questions involving objects. So, many psychologists outside of cognitive psychology are interested in applications of mental imagery to other fields in psychology. Such application includes using guided imagery techniques for controlling pain and for strengthening immune responses and otherwise promoting health. With such techniques, you could imagine being at a beautiful beach and feeling very comfortable, letting your pain fade into the background. Not everyone is equally skilled in creating and manipulating mental images. However, research in applied setting and in the laboratory indicates that some of us are better able to create mental images than are others. Research also indicates that the use of mental images can help to improve memory. In the case of persons with Down syndrome, the use of mental images in conjunction with hearing a story improved memory for the material as compared with just hearing the story. So, the next is the dual code theory, images and symbols. Dual code theory, we use both pictorial and verbal codes for representing informations in our minds. These two codes organize information into knowledge that can be acted on, stored somehow, and later retrieved for subsequent use. So, analog codes resemble the object they are representing according to Pivio. Mental images are analog codes. So, for example, the example of analog codes are trees and rivers might be represented by analog codes. Another example, just as the movement of the hand on an analog clock are analogous to the passage of time, the mental images we form in our minds are analogous with the physical stimuli we observe. So the next code is the symbolic codes. It is a form of knowledge representation that has been chosen arbitrarily to stand for something that does not perceptually resemble what is being represented. So the example of symbolic codes is just as a digital watch uses arbitrary symbols, typically numericals, to represent the passage of time. Our minds use arbitrary symbols, words, and combinations of words to represent many symbols. So in symbolic codes daw, ang binigyan na example dito is yung digital watch. So, di ba some digital watch na nakikita natin uses numerical numbers. So, instead of number 1, they use the letter I to represent number 1. And they use two I's or dalawang I's to represent the number 2. So, that is symbolic codes. So, under the symbolic codes, there is an example also. So, the sun can be used as well to represent the flow of time as shown in hourglass. So, as you can see in the picture, there is an hourglass. So, yeah. Ginagamit din ang sun to represent an hour, 'di ba? So, there are hourglass na kapag naubos kapag naubos lahat ng sand na nasa taas or naubos na pababa yung sand, ibig sabihin 1 hour was already left or tapos na ang isang oras. So, a symbol may be anything that is arbitrarily designated to stand for something other than itself. So, in symbols, merong mga bagay na ginagamit to represent other things rather than itself, di ba? Kagaya ng example kanina. So, Pivio, consistent with this dual code theory, noted that verbal information seems to be processed differently than pictorial information. Yan yung sabi ni Pivio. So, in one study, participants were shown both rapid sequence of pictures and sequence of words. They then were asked to recall the words or the pictures in one or two ways. So, one way was at random, so that they recalled as many items as possible, regardless of the orders in which items were presented. The other way is in correct sequence. So, sa binigay na example or sa isang study, if we relate it in our study, di ba? Sometimes, mas madadali nating ma-remember or yung mga pictures kapag gumagamit, if we recall it randomly, kapag hindi siya sunod-sunod, di ba? And sometimes, mas madali din nating ma-recall yung mga words if we recall it sequentially or kapag sunod-sunod. So, it just depend kung anong ang mas madali and kung anong mas comfortable tayo or kung ano sa tingin natin ang mas madali nating maalala ang isang bagay. So, either we describe it randomly or we describe it sequentially. So, according dito, an imaginal is an analogical code and a verbal is a symbolic code. So, storing knowledge as abstract concept, propositional theory. So, conceptual propositional theory, or also known or commonly known as propositional theory. So, propositional theory suggests that we do not store mental representation in the form of images or mere words. So, we may experience our mental representations as images, but these images are epiphenomena or secondary and derivative phenomena that occurs as a result of other more basic cognitive process. So, yun yung propositional theory. According to propositional theory, our mental representation, sometimes called mentalism, more closely resemble the abstract form of proposition. A proposition is the meaning underlying a particular relationship among concepts. Anderson and Bauer have moved beyond the original conceptualization to a more complex model that encompasses multiple forms of mental representation. In order for us to know how propositional representation works. So we will go back to the given example in figure 7.3. So in figure 7.3a, you would say the table is above the cat. You also could say the cat is beneath the table. Both these statements indicate the same relationship as above the cat is the table. With a little extra work, you probably could come up with a dozen or more ways of verbally representing this relationship. So logicians have devised a shorthand means called predicate calculus, or expressing the underlying meanings of a relationship. It attempts to strip away the various superficial differences in the ways we describe the deeper meaning of proposition. So proposition may be used to describe any kind of relationship. We use proposition to represent any kind of relationship including actions, attributes, spatial positions, class membership, or almost any other conceivable relationship. The possibility for combining proposition into complex propositional representation relationships makes the use of such representations highly flexible and widely applicable. So as you can see in the next example in figure 7.1, proposition or propositional representations of underlying meanings. So here is we can see the type of relationship, representation in words, propositional representation, and imaginal representation. So under the type of relationship we have actions. So actions converted into representational words, it becomes a mouth beat a cat. And if we convert it into propositional representation, it shows bite, actions, mouse, agent of actions, and cat is the object, and the imaginal representation. So the next is attributes. So if we convert it to representation in words, it is stated that mice are furry. So if we convert it to propositional representation, it is external surface characteristics, furry is attribute, and mouse is object. So in spatial positions, if we convert it to representation in words, a cat is under the table. And if we convert it to propositional representation, it is stated that vertically higher position, table, cat, and the imaginal representation. So class or category membership. So if we convert it to representation in words, a cat is an animal. And if we convert it to propositional representation, it shows that categorical membership, animal, category, cat, member. So here is the imaginal representation. So in this table, propositions are experienced in shorthand form known as predicate calculus, commonly used to express underlying meanings. This shorthand is intended only to give some ideas of how the underlying meanings of knowledge might be represented. It is not believed that this form is literally the form in which meaning is represented in the mind. In general, the shorthand form for representing propositions is this: relationship between element, subject element, and object element. So, ang proposition daw is it just give an abstract idea or hints sa atin. Kasi, hindi naman talaga natin masasabi na totally na i-imagine talaga natin kung ano yung look ng isang bagay, or perfectly mai-imagine natin kung ano yung position, kung ano yung size, or kung ano yung shape. So the propositions gives us an abstract idea, and our mind process that abstract idea to come up an imaginary representation, or para ma-picture out talaga natin yung perfect na look ng isang bagay or yung isang situations or event. So, the key idea is that the proposition form of mental representation is neither in words nor in images. Rather, it is an abstract form representing the underlying meaning of knowledge, gaya ng sabi ko kanina. Thus, a proposition for a sentence would not retain the acoustic or visual properties of the words. Similarly, a proposition for a picture would not retain the exact perceptual form of the picture. Kagaya ng gi-explain ko kanina. So, according to propositional theory, pictorial and verbal informations are encoded and stored as proposition. Then, when we wish to retrieve the information from storage, the propositional representation is retrieved. From it, our minds recreate the verbal and imaginal code accurately. So, yung mga pictorial and verbal informations are encoded and stored as proposition. So, when we wish to retrieve the information, the proportional representation is nire-retrieve niya. And from that, our minds recreate the verbal and imaginary code accurately using propositional. So, some evidence suggests that these representations need not to be exclusive. People seem to be able to employ both types of representation to increase their performance on cognitive tests. The next topic is, do propositional theory and imagery hold up to their promises? What are the limits to analogical representation of images? So for example, look quickly at figure 7.5 as you can see on the screen. Then look away. Does figure 7.5 contains a parallelogram, a four-sided figure that has two pairs of parallel lines of equal length? So in the study, participants appeared unable to call up a precise analogical mental images or image. They could not use a mental image to trace the line to determine which component shapes were or were not part of a whole figure. So to read, these findings suggested the use of propositional code rather than analogical one. So when we use analogical code, example of propositional code would be, the picture represents a Star of David or two overlapping triangles, one of which is inverted. Another possible explanation is that people have analogical mental images that are imprecise in some way. So there are additional limits to knowledge representation and mental images. In contrast to the work just discussed, there is some evidence that we do not necessarily need a propositional code to manipulate information but can manipulate mental imagery directly. So participants in the study by Finke and colleagues manipulated mental images by combining two distinct images to form different mental images together, as you can see on the screen in figure 7.6. This manipulation of mental images may be thought of as imaginal gestalt experience. In the combined image, the whole of the two combined images differ from the sum of its two distinct parts. The study showed that in some situations, mental images can be combined effectively to create mental images. The images may be of geometric shapes, or letters, or objects. It appears that propositional codes are less likely to influence imaginal ones when participants create their own mental images, rather than when participants are presented with a picture to be represented. However, propositional code may influence imaginal ones. This influence is especially likely to occur when the picture used for creating an image is ambiguous, as you can see in figure 7.6a, b, and c, or rather abstract. So other investigations have built on Finke's work regarding the construction of mental images. They presented an alternative view of Chambers and Risberg's finding regarding the manipulation of ambiguous features. They believe that the mental reinterpretation of ambiguous features involve two manipulations. So the first is mental realignment of the reference frame. This alignment would involve a shift in the proposition orientation of the figures on the mental page of screen on which the image is displayed. And the second manipulation is the mental reconstrual or reinterpretation of the parts of the figure. And this construal would be of the duck's bill or the rabbit's ear. The participant may be unlikely to manipulate mental images spontaneously to reinterpret ambiguous figures, but such manipulation occurs when participants are given the right context. Under what condition do participants mentally reinterpret their image of the duck rabbit figure, as shown is in Figure 7.6a, and some of the other ambiguous figures? There are four supporting hints that we could use to interpret the ambiguous figure. So first, we have implicit reference frame hint. So in this hint, participants first were shown another ambiguous figure involving realignment of the reference frame. So as you can see in Figure 7.6b, so the ambiguous figure shows a hawk's head or a goose tail or a hawk's tail or a goose head. So the second hint is the explicit reference frame hint. So in this hint, participants were asked to modify the reference frame by considering either the back of the head of the animal they had already seen as the front of the head of some other animals. So, or the front of the thing you were seeing as the back of something else, considered an abstract hint. So that it refers to Figure 7.6c. So maybe using explicit reference frame hint, so maybe we can see the picture as the head of some other animals, or we can see the ambiguous picture as the front head of the other animal. So the next hint is attentional hint. So participants were directed to attend to regions of the figures where realignments or reconstrual were to occur. And the fourth hint is the construal from good parts. So in this hint, participants were asked to construe an image from parts determined to be good. Additionally, some spontaneous reinterpretation of mental images for ambiguous figures may occur. This is particularly likely for images of figures that may be reinterpreted without realigning the reference frame. The investigators went on to suggest that the process involved in constructing and manipulating mental images are similar to the processes involved in perceptual processes. So not everyone agrees with these views. Some support for their views has been found by cognitive psychologists who hold that mental imagery and visual perceptions are functionality equivalent. Overall, the weight of the evidence seems to indicate there are multiple codes rather than just a single code, but the controversy continues. So the summary: mental representation, something that stands for these people of what you know about them. Knowledge representation, the form for what you know in your mind about things, ideas, events, and so on in the outside world. External representation designates structures in the environment that allow learners to interact with some content domain, example books. And imagery is a symbolic representation of things that are not currently seen or sensed by the sense organ. And dual code theory, we use both pictorial and verbal code for representing information. The analog codes, mental images, and symbolic codes is a form of knowledge representation that has been chosen arbitrarily to stand for something that does not perceptually resemble what is being represented. And propositional theory suggests that we do not store mental representation by form, images, or mere words. So that's the end of my report, and thank you everyone. God bless.